Okay, cool. The first paper is due next Wednesday, as a reminder. Um, and that's on the default topic being Athens and Sparta, but there's plenty of other stuff you can do between, like Stone Age and really even this point, because the second paper topic is on like late Middle Ages stuff, so you can even do early Middle Ages if you want. But I mean, we've got so much with Greece and Rome and all the stuff before even that, Egypt and Mesopotamia. So plenty of stuff you can write about if you want. If you just want to do the default topic, it's up on Blackboard. Again, for all of you here in class, if you can get the paper printed out and brought to me physically, that'd be great. Because not only are most of my students in this class online, but I've got 2 like completely full online classes for 101. So my inbox is going to be packed. So if you can physically bring the paper in, I'll be able to grade it like right away and not worry about losing it in the shuffle of my my inbox. And a lot of times even stuff won't send right because technology. So it's just much easier and safer if you can physically hand it in. Obviously, for you online folks, it's fine. Just make sure you send it to my Francis Marion email, and don't do the Google Docs thing where I have to like request permission from you to even be able to open it. Make sure I can open it right away. So like Word document, PDF document. I've had people do Google Docs before, but like they linked, not they linked it, they attached it. That's what I want, is actually attaching it to the email so I can immediately access it, and then it's fine. If I can't access it right away, then I'm going to need you to resend it. Okay. And I checked, let me check the calendar again real quick. It's November 4th and 5th we have off. No, sorry. Yes, 4th and 5th we have off for fall break. So we won't be here. I'll talk more about that next week. We won't be here for like a Monday class, but we will be back for the Wednesday. So anyway, that's all I've got. For the online students, you have until Wednesday to get your test done. I haven't actually checked to see how many are done yet. But please take care of that before Wednesday, because then I will be closing it and getting them graded. Yeah, so on to Chapter 7. We have the early Middle Ages. So we've moved from, the end of Rome and the very first part of the Middle Ages to now the Middle Ages proper and what that all entails. So the chapter starts with how monks were important in maintaining, really Western civilization in a lot of cases. Early monks were really the only way I can describe them would be almost like the monks you see in like more Asian style monks, where they're like living off in the wilderness in like some little hut, or in some of these cases, what they call them, pillar monks, where like they would stand on top of these pillars to try and achieve enlightenment. Like it was very different from what it's going to become, where they would actually start building monasteries and becoming a major part of Western culture. In Egypt and Syria, they were not really a part of Roman society. But as we get into the early Middle Ages, we have Benedict of Nursia, who creates the, what's it called, the Benedictine Benedictine rule, or is that, I might be thinking of something a little bit later. But this was a sort of a standardized, that's the word I'm looking for, like a standardized version of monasticism where they build the monasteries and come together. Oh yeah, there it is, the Benedictine rule, which is to say, like a guide for how monks should live and what they should do and like their important duties and all of that. So it was due to Benedict of Nursia, which is this guy here. He's what started the medieval monasticism. And just a a common theme I noticed in some of the images from this time, the dove in the sunbeam is typically seen as either divine inspiration or just straight up like the Holy Spirit appearing before them and inspiring them to do what they ended up doing. But because of the how should I put it? The way the divine was seen back then, they were always shown as looking a little bit afraid because, oh, it's God coming to speak to me. I better be on my best behavior. But looking at it like without that context, it looks like a dove flew by and scared the dude, which in some of these images are really funny. Like Benedict here, he does actually look like he's looking up and getting divine knowledge. Other dudes are like, holy crap, a bird flew by my head. Particularly, I think Pope Gregory the Great, which is the next guy here. It's a very, very funny image. Anyway, here is the monastery in Monte Cassino, which is in, I guess it's in Italy, based on the name. It's actually been rebuilt since the Middle Ages because if I remember right, it was used as a fortification in, I think, World War I, and needless to say, it got shelled to pieces. So this is somewhat rebuilt since then, but the same style of building. And as you can see up here on the hill, actually really well defendable, which again is why it was used as like a fortified location in World War I. But considering how dangerous things were in the early Middle Ages, monasteries were as much for getting away from society as they were protecting ourselves from like the roaming bandits. So, monastic life, again, they lived together in a monastery. It's like communal living, typically under an abbot who was the one that ran the place. They owned no personal property because they were just living there at the monastery and working together to keep it running. Would often take vows of silence to better contemplate what the whole spiritual thing they were doing, which sounds like some mental torture. It's like, oh yeah, you don't speak unless you're praying. So there was spiritual work, but also manual work. Plowed fields, wrote manuscripts, built buildings. And this was a changeover from the old classical days of work being seen as beneath people. That was something that you got a servant or slave to do. Here, manual labor was seen as a good thing because, well, it was seen as not just working to better the monastery, but also, the mission of God. And it got to the point that monasteries were self-sufficient. They could often grow enough to survive and even trade with other places. And this here in particular, they would trade between monasteries because, as we saw at the end of the last chapter, most of the cities were gone, or at least had been abandoned. You didn't really have Rome and Ravenna and the other major cities anymore. You had a whole bunch of countryside with people living in tiny little farms trying to survive. And then the monasteries. The monasteries were like the center of civilization at this point. And the monasteries would actually trade among themselves, as we'll see when we get to the illuminated manuscripts. It wasn't that they were like trading for food or supplies. They were trading for like fancy stuff, like in, say, there was a monastery in France that had access to this really special, I think it was like a blue dye that they would use for copying the manuscripts. And that dye could only be found in what's the modern-day Middle East. So they traded all the way across Europe for this dye in a time when trade routes were basically non-existent. So it's just to show how relatively powerful these monasteries were, and that they were organized enough in that they were like trading for things that aren't really survival requirements. So here's a basic monastery. You've got the building where everybody lives. You've got many, many fields here, you know, because, well, there were quite a few people living in here, so they needed to survive. And you would often also have little, like, attached villages. As we'll see later on, the monks quickly stopped doing the work and have, like, people working the land for them, but that's a little bit later in the Middle Ages. Here we go. This is one of the big things that monks did was copying manuscripts. In particular, the Bible, but also just other holy works, and even what were seen as pagan scripts, which is to say anything that's not the Bible is seen as pagan. But their big goal was to take things that had been written on papyrus scrolls and copying them to parchment. Parchment is basically like really thin leather because it's made of animal skin. And the thing about parchment is it sticks around. We still have, I was going to say several, we have many examples of stuff that was made at this time still today because they just last. This also institutionalized reading and writing within the monasteries, which was like the only place where people could read and write. Again, outside of like Constantinople, because that was still relatively intact. But anything like west of Greece, you were living in the dirt and doing your best to survive. And the only place that had like writing and reading and any kind of education at all was within the monasteries. So here we have, this was one of the saints, but this is just showing you the level of detail in the illuminated manuscripts, because this would just be like a page in a Bible, it's just there, and this would take forever to make. This was, really, really detailed, and they, had, like I said, had to get very specific dye from places to get the various colors and whatnot. So this was a long-term project. This wasn't like, quickly copying one thing to another and then being done. This was what you were doing for the rest of your life. I mentioned this in the American history class, but there's quite a few times in the various manuscripts being copied where the monks would like write in the margins of like little personal notes of what was going on and how happy they were that their lamp was going out, so now they could stop writing and go to bed. It was a lot of work. It was a lot of just tedious stuff. But again, reading and writing, it's extremely important. And as we're going to see, getting into later chapters, the monasteries became the centers of education in Europe. So on to Italy. What did I talk about? Oh yeah, no, never mind. Okay, so on to Italy. We had the Lombards. They were another Germanic group. I didn't talk about them, I don't think, but they were on some of the earlier maps I showed you guys. They were just like another group of Germanic folks. Moved into northern Italy. Fought back against Justinian's outposts that were there because, again, Justinian took most of Italy, so now the Lombards are fighting back. They were Arian, so they were the, quote, wrong kind of Christian, at least as far as Rome was concerned, but converted to Roman Orthodoxy in 680. But despite this, they still fought the papacy. I guess it didn't really matter, which, again, as we'll see going forward, especially next semester, just because you agree on religious stuff doesn't necessarily mean you're working together. So, the papacy remained relatively weak at this time, even as they were having the beginnings of a schism with the Eastern Roman Church, so what would become the Greek Orthodox Church. The nature of Christ as to whether he was like subservient to or equal to God, as we've seen, the idea of the Trinity comes later. So there was this toss-up as to what the real Orthodox decision was. We'll also get into that a little bit later. So here is the king of the Lombards. Has freaking like wolfhounds here. Not wolfhounds. Wolfhounds are stocky. Like greyhounds almost. So this leads into the first of the powerful popes in the West. You can tell from the name, he was pretty important. So elected in 590, Gregory had done a lot throughout life. He wasn't like we have with modern day popes typically. Now, some popes did have, a life before joining the church. But most popes are, chosen from the cardinals, who are really, really high-ranking members of the church who had basically been working in the church their entire lives. Pope Gregory the Great here was a Roman aristocrat, senator, soldier against the Lombards, monk, and emissary to Constantinople. He had been around. He had made quite a bit of use of his long life. So when he became pope, he officially promoted monasticism. I thought that was me. Trying to make it a major part of the church in the West. He sent Augustine to Britain to also turn it into a Christian province, essentially. Set up bishops in Canterbury and York, who would then appoint regular bishops and push forward a more organized version of the church, because in Europe, the church was based on the various, were they called dioceses back then? They were basically based out of the provinces that Rome had created during the reign of Diocletian. After the Tetrarchy and the various provinces. Now each province had its own bishop, which would again become the diocese. So in Britain, they were starting from scratch, so they were able to split up the diocese more with better planning, I should say, than in Europe. Similar to, say, roads in cities that were created after motor vehicles became a thing, compared to cities like, say, Boston, whose roads are based on cow paths that they just paved over. and it is terrible trying to drive there. Even, I mean, the only time I drove through Boston was early in the morning on, might have been Memorial Day, so there was like no traffic. It was still horrible. There was the roads, there were no sense in the roads. So similar to that, in that like in Rome or in Europe it was designed like by a Roman general, compared to in England where they're like, okay, from the start we're designing it based on the church. This is the picture that I really like. This is Pope Gregory being inspired by, the will of God or the Holy Spirit or whatever, but it really was like, oh, geez, a bird got in my room. Which, I mean, if you've ever been hit in the face or almost hit in the face by a bird, even the little ones, you don't want to get, they're solid. Especially a big old dove, which is essentially just a pigeon. You don't want that thing smacking you in the face. Oh, yeah. So this is, I guess, an earlier Pope Gregory. And then we have this, just like, looks like freaking warrior Santa Claus going on here. I'd be a little intimidated by this guy. All right. So on to the bishops. So they were meant to be mediators. They were meant to work with the common people and mediate between the people and the church, or oftentimes the political rulers of the region. Their offices were for life, so oftentimes they would be around more often in a region than, say, a count who might get overthrown or mysteriously die so that his son could take over. The bishops were a big part of Western life. What do we have here? Okay, I'll answer that after class. Here we are. So a diocese is a region of a bishop's jurisdiction, again, like a modern day, well, I say modern day, but dioceses are still a thing. Here in the South, we just have counties that are based on territory. Up when I was doing grad school in Rhode Island, they still called regions of the town diocese because it is so heavily Catholic up there. That was the first time I'd heard the word used outside of a history book. So, yeah, that's the thing. And again, bishops typically were like the men on the ground in terms of the church. They were there helping the people pay for repair and civic improvements, whereas the actual governmental leaders would collect taxes and then not do anything I'd say not do anything. Wouldn't do anything for the people with the taxes. They would be building their manor houses or whatever. So the folks that the public looked to actually help improve their life were the bishops, were the church, compared to, the government. So here we have the various dioceses in Rome, which again were split up based on the Roman provinces that Diocletian put together. So a lot of these areas were maybe a little bit too large for a single bishop to handle, or in some places were really tight and squished together. Granted, this is the Eastern Roman Empire, so it was more based on, what Constantinople was up to. But as they get up into England, they split it more evenly. So you have, the big cities that would have their own archbishop, and then each bishop would get a region to oversee. But same as with the monks. We're going to see later that bishops start to kind of pull out of public life, and they're busy being really rich church leaders. So we'll have the friars later, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So, at this period, the monks were the mediators for people, and the saints were also seen as mediators, but between the common man and Jesus. So, unlike what we have with, say, most Protestant denominations, I mean, like, all the ones I can think of, but I'm pretty sure there are some that still, like, use the saints. Basically, the idea was that we as humans can't directly communicate with Jesus because he's, too powerful and beyond us. But the saints were those that had lived especially pious lives, and while they had died and gone to heaven, or in many cases were seen as simply, ascending to heaven, they were still human, and thus you could speak to the saints, and the saints would, on your behalf, speak to Christ. And the way that you spoke to the saints was not simply, praying wherever you were. You had to go somewhere that had relics. These would often be bones of the saints or something that they had owned during their life, clothes, books, etc., things that were like a major part of what the saint was doing. And the reason that the saints were something that had become part of society was once Rome legalized Christianity and we didn't have a constant stream of people being killed for their faith, we needed another way to communicate with Jesus, because the idea with the saints, or with the martyrs, was that, oh, hey, I knew, Gaius, whoever, and he died for his faith and went to heaven, but since he knew me, he can speak to Christ on my behalf. Now that we don't have people constantly dying because of the Roman government, we need another way to contact Jesus, and that was through these saints. So the Bishop Ambrose really began this idea of the saints. They were considered as still being alive and active, having risen to heaven rather than dying, despite the fact that they would often use supposed bones of these guys to contact the saints. But I guess they spiritually rose to heaven and left the body behind. I don't know. They're often thought to have miraculous powers, so if you needed to be healed, you wouldn't bother Jesus with it. You would actually speak to a saint, pray over their relics. Often specifically going in and touching them would potentially heal you. Outside of the spiritual belief, this also gave bishops a lot of actual temporal power, because the people who wish to come to speak to the saints to get a message to Jesus would have to come and speak to the bishops who were actually physically there. So, if you were a regular person living in this time, you would be far more likely to go and speak to the bishops in order to speak to the saints, in order to speak to Jesus, about important things than some political leader who doesn't really care about your well-being at all. And especially at a time when the average life expectancy was going down, you were far more concerned about your immortal soul than what some asshole count was up to. So here's an image of a bunch of various saints. If I was raised as a good Catholic, which I was not, I'd probably be able to name most of these. I was raised Methodist, so these are... I might be able to pull out a few of them. Oh, no, none of them are actually showing up in there. So, especially when we get into the Renaissance, a lot of the saints were depicted in very specific ways. Saint, was it Bartholomew, who was specifically shot to death with arrows, whenever he's shown in art, he's always like standing there with arrows in him, like looking up to heaven, because he was martyred for his faith. So that was often how they were remembered. What else? Oh, to bring this back up real quick, there was when I taught upstate, we were right there by Bob Jones University, and Bob Jones has a lot of stolen religious art that they acquired during World War II without paying for it. Anyway, because so much religious art is prior to the Protestant Reformation, most religious art is Catholic. So when I was in there, there was one of the people that worked there giving a tour to this Asian couple. And the husband obviously couldn't speak English very well. So she would tell the information to the wife, and then the wife would translate it to the husband. And one of the things that stuck out to me was, it wasn't this specific piece of art, but it was a very similar piece of art with like Jesus and Mary and then the various saints on either side. And the lady's explaining, this is Jesus and Mary. And then these made up people that were known as the saints. And it's like, I get that as Protestants, we don't, recognize that the saints are divine typically, but they existed. Like, they were real. We've got writings that they put out, and lots of stuff about them. We often have like the leftovers of their bodies. It was really interesting hearing a lady be like, oh, here's Jesus and Mary, and then these people that were made up. It's like, we know these people existed. What are you talking about? But then again, Bob Jones is really Protestant. So, we can't recognize that other folks exist. Anyway, so onto the political side of things, which, there wasn't a lot of difference in the church and politics at the time. But the way that lands were ruled after Rome fell, typically the Germanic tribes had kings, or known as, rex, which is just Latin for king. But this wasn't the sort of kingship we think of later in the Middle Ages, and, well, not so much today. But they weren't like a divinely appointed monarch. They often didn't even have like any kind of lineage. They were just the best general out of the lot who could convince others to follow them, and then when they've got enough power, they're just like, hey, I'm the king of this region, and everybody else is like, yeah, all right, we're not going to fight you over it. However, due to the size of their warband, they couldn't stay in a single region permanently because the region couldn't support them with food and supplies. Because, again, this is like early Middle Ages where we've lost basically all the technology of Rome, and people are doing their best to just survive. So there isn't a lot of extra food to go around. But this is why the way the kings of this era, they weren't in charge of like a specific area of land. So say France or Spain or England's a different case because its borders are very specific. It's an island. But specifically, kings were kings of a group of people. The Merovingians, for example, were the kings of the Franks. The land of Francia, which would really be made more plain later, that wasn't as important. Like, wherever the people lived who you ruled over, that was your land, I guess, as a king. But it wasn't like, everything within this region is mine. It was more about the people who swore loyalty to you. So at this time, the Frankish nobles, and really any kind of noble, but we're going to stick with the Franks because they're extremely important for what's coming up. Any of their wealth, which is to say land and gold, will be divided equally among their heirs, which is to say their male children. And especially when it came to major rulers, this quickly would lead to the sons murdering each other until there was only one left, so he could take all of the land, or all of the wealth. Which is something that we'll fix a little bit later, but this becomes a problem in how things go for quite some time. So we have here, this great general standing on a rock with some runic writing on it, holding this symbol of the church, the holy hand grenade, depending on if you've watched that. All right, and on to more specific kingship is the Merovingians. So, we talked about Clovis being extremely important in creating the kingdom of the Franks. But once he died, his 4 sons now had to split his land. Well, they didn't like that, so they fought each other until Clothar, which was, like 47 years later, technically, managed to outlive the others. But 3 years later, he died because by this point he was old, and his 3 sons then fought each other over his land. So while this is going on, the Merovingian line is getting weak because they're so busy fighting each other, they're not really strengthening the kingdom of the Franks. So various noble families known as mayors of the palace, they were, how do I put it, they essentially would do the work that the king was supposed to be doing while the king was all fighting, be it foreign enemies or his brothers. In particular, Pepin of Landen in 631 managed to basically get all the power of a king while the actual king was off not doing his job. Technically, Pepin was still very much a mayor of the palace. He just had gotten a bunch of duties on top of his regular work. So Pepin is the start of what we'll be seeing with the Carolingian line, and this is the reason why Clovis was important, is that his family ends up being awful, and it leads to this next guy, this next family that basically created modern Europe. So this is Francia, or the Merovingian kingdom. So it's all of most of modern day France, as well as a little bit extra here on the ends, pushing a bit more into Spain than modern day. And a quick aside before we get into the Carolingians. There's other stuff happening in the world at the time, which is to say the rise of Islam. Obviously, we don't have a ton of time to go into this, so the cliff notes, Muhammad was a merchant in Mecca. He received what he believed to be messages from God, which in his mind was like the next step in the Abrahamic religions, because for the most part, Christianity sees Judaism as like the first part. And literally, the Old Testament is the Torah. This is just like the Old Testament is the Judaic Bible, and then Christianity is that plus the New Testament. And for Islam, it was like, okay, these two plus the Quran is like the full breadth of their faith. So a couple of definitions here. The Ummah were folks that agreed with what he was doing and created a community around him. The term Islam actually means submission to the will of God, whereas a Muslim is one who has submitted to the will of God. So that's why those words are what they are. The important event for Islam, the most important event for Islam, was the Hijra, which was 622 CE, which, again, that wasn't even a thing until like almost 1,000, because it's the Gregorian calendar, so it's like they took where they were and then extrapolated it back. This is when Muhammad had to flee from Mecca to Medina, which is like year zero for Islamic chronology. So like a traditional Islamic calendar is 622 years behind like modern Gregorian calendars. And in fact, for a long time, Russia used its own version of the calendar. I think it was the same year, but like the months were different, which we'll also see more next semester. It wasn't until real recently that they switched, or I don't even know if they actually have switched. They just know that there's like a different calendar for everybody else. We also have the Quran, which I mentioned. There's actually two spellings of it. I think this is the more, they didn't use the same letters as us, so this is like a phonetic spellings. But this is their holy book, which, as I said, was like a part 3 to the Torah and the New Testament. Because as far as Muhammad was concerned, Islam and Christianity were the teachings of God, just they weren't done yet, much like how a lot of Christianity looks on Judaism as this was what God did, but didn't quite get to Jesus. And for Muhammad, Jesus was like he was a great prophet, but he wasn't the end of what God was up to. So, the 5 pillars of Islam, there's only one God, which in Islam, Allah just is their word for God, which is why it's weird when people are like, oh, these people don't even understand that God exists. It's like they just used a different word, guys. One God and he must be obeyed. That's literally like the first commandment. 2, Muslims are obliged to pray 5 times a day facing Mecca. So depending on where you were, you had to like face a certain direction and pray towards Mecca. 3, give charity, which, all right, that's an easy one. It's hard to argue with that. Number 4, fast daylight hours of the lunar month of Ramadan, which is part of their culture, which a lot of folks like I've seen online. It's like, I can't wait for the sun to go down. I'm so hungry, because once the sun goes down, you can eat. Like it's not like a week-long fast. It's just you can't. You're supposed to fast during the day. I say a week-long, a month-long. And then there was the Hajj, which is a pilgrimage to Mecca. That has been relaxed a little bit in the modern day because Islam has spread all over the world, and it's really hard to get all the way back to the Middle East to visit Mecca. And this has actually become something of a safety concern, not because that area of the world's particularly dangerous, but because so many people pour into this one city all at once. And it's literally people getting crushed to death sometimes because of how many people. There's been many accidents over the throughout history of like big sporting events, and there will be an emergency, and people will be trying to get out, and there's so many people in one place that people just get crushed. Modern day pilgrimages to Mecca are very difficult just due to the logistics of that many people. So Islam was seen as a theocracy under the sacred rule known as Sharia, which the various legal scholars of the Quran would decide out on, what was meant for the modern day. This is Mecca. This is I always forget the name of the big cube in the middle. But that's like the direction that everybody's supposed to pray towards. The cube has a name, but I can't remember what it is. So as I said, Islam spread very fast. By the time Muhammad died, it had taken over most of Arabia due to the various desert tribes uniting together under this single rulership. Because as we see, especially as we're going to be seeing in Europe, the more organized religions tend to draw people much more quickly than like we saw with Rome, like Noumena, where it's just like, oh, there's just like vague things we don't know, and there's divine spirits that control them. Here it's like there's a very specific God, and you're supposed to specifically do what he says. It's more ordered, and people find comfort in that. The jihad, holy war, Muhammad carried out against unbelievers, but it has another meaning. It is seen as an individual's personal calling to conform to the will of Allah, which is to say, it's just your own personal struggle against like the flesh, as the King James Bible would put it, and trying to be, as good of a Muslim as you can be when you've got all the various temptations of the world. So within 100 years of Muhammad's death, Islam had taken control of Arabia, Persia, Jerusalem, Egypt, Carthage, and southern Spain. So they had pretty much taken up all of the land that was once part of the Roman Empire up into, they're pushing towards Constantinople. So they expanded through regions where Christians and Jews had been living, especially in the Middle East with the Jews. But there wasn't like a big conflict over it. Christians and Jews were seen as people of the book, and by Muhammad's decree, they would be treated well. There was oftentimes if you weren't Muslim, you had to pay like extra taxes, but you were still able to keep your religion. They didn't come in and like force you to convert to Islam. That's a later ruler that starts that. So we can see here the extreme expanse of Islam over, what is this? A little over 100 years. So you've got here under Muhammad, or at the time of Muhammad's death, very quickly spreading through the rest of Arabia into the Persian Empire, through Egypt, and then in the following years through North Africa and even into modern-day Spain. We'll also get into that here real quick. And this was the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine Empire was shrinking. The Lombards were pushing them here. You had various Slavic people pushing up in northern Greece. So while this expansion was happening, Constantinople was shrinking. Or I should say the Byzantine Empire was shrinking. Obviously, such a powerful, well, I was going to say, group, but, specifically religious organization, they quickly began to split over how Islam will be ruled. After Muhammad died, there was, of course, the concern of succession. One dude was murdered, another assassinated, which led to 3 groups coming to represent the majority of Islam. So you have the Kharijites. They believe that only the purest and most deeply committed to Islam could be counted as Muslims. The Shias, believing that those that were the leaders of their various lands were like divinely appointed by Allah. It's not dissimilar to how the Pope used to be seen, where they could basically do no wrong because they are being I can't want to say God. I mean, God, Allah, same thing, are directly speaking through them. And then we have the Sunnis, who are the largest group. They see their leaders as human and fallible, and their main goal is to defend the faith and continue the law that Muhammad put forth. There is a lot of conflict between these two. This group is so tiny that they're barely even counted. But these two in particular, a lot of conflict. Oftentimes the areas that are seen as being like, oh, these are radical Muslims that wanted to kill everybody, that's usually the Shias. Because whatever their leaders say goes, and you can't really question it. But then you have a much larger group of Muslims who are like, yeah, we agree with the leaders, but they're also human and can make mistakes, and that often gets them killed. So what you often see on the news is, oh, all the Muslims are out to get us. Like, they're busy killing each other because of certain groups that would take power and then oppress the other group. Most of the people who are dying to Shias are Sunnis. But that's also later. I just want to mention that for modern stuff. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire, the way the book describes it, becomes Byzantine, which historians will argue over that. It's like, oh, you can't call it Byzantine because they're still a Roman Empire, and then other groups are just the opposite. It's like, well, they're not really even the Roman Empire anymore. It doesn't matter. As we mentioned, the Islamic powers overtook Egypt and Syria. In 1717 and 1718, there was a direct attack on Constantinople, which they were able to fight back. And this is what the book describes as the shift from the Eastern Roman Empire to truly Byzantine, which is to say that their focus, I hope I've got this turned on. I will be very upset if I have to do all this again when I get home. Okay, cool. All right. With this extremely dangerous group right there to the south, they focused all their attention on the east. The Byzantine Empire became more Greek because, that's just where they are, and focused on Greek Orthodox Christianity with no aims to restore the Roman Empire because, well, they've got their own problems to deal with, and if the rest of Europe wants to have a bunch of smelly Germanic kings, whatever, we're not dealing with that right now. It went so far as Leo III did away with monasticism, so he could tax the lands that the monasteries once held. So obviously we're going the opposite direction of the West, where monasticism is being promoted and made like a central tenet of the church. That said, the getting rid of the monasteries so that they can tax the lands that the monasteries held is something that Europe will do later. So iconoclasm. This is something that Leo and his son Constantine V were a big part of. And also, I mentioned this when we talked about the Hagia Sophia, Islam is also iconoclast. So the iconoclastic thought is that icons and pictures or symbols that represent Christ were seen as idols. So you're not supposed to have, like for example, the best example I can think of is the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, where you've literally got like God reaching out of a cloud to give the divine spark to Adam. They hate that. You're not supposed to have images of like divine beings, God, Christ, and for Islam also even Muhammad. Like any depiction of Muhammad is seen as like really bad. So that's, well, why you have so many pictures in Protestantism of like Jesus, because that's like, he's our main guy. But you don't see that in Islam because Islam is an iconoclastic religion. And Greek Orthodox, similarly, you don't see like stained glass windows depicting Jesus or big images of Jesus, or especially with the Catholics having like a full-on crucifix in the middle of the church. And this was a major part of the schism between Greek Orthodox and Roman Orthodox churches. This idea of, oh, these images of God are idols, which is something that like a lot of Protestants argued over when the Protestant Reformation happened. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. So, we have the attack on Constantinople. Do I have? Yeah. Do you guys know what this is? No? This was known as Greek fire. It was an ancient, it was napalm. It was, I forget exactly what they used to make it, but it was an ancient version of modern day napalm. They would have, as you can see here, they'd have like a tube going up through the neck, and there was a pump right here that they would pump it out of. And the thing about napalm, if you're not familiar, see these guys here falling off of the boat into the water? That fire is going to keep burning even while they're underwater. It keeps burning until it's done burning. And by then, you are very dead. This stuff was nasty. I mean, again, like modern day napalm, it's war crime stuff. But the fact that they had this stuff so long ago is crazy. That was an episode of Mythbusters years back where they're like, is this really a thing? Like, can this be done? And they did it. And like the whole time they're like, this is really dangerous because if this stuff catches on fire in the pump or in the neck, it's going to explode. But they did successfully like make the pump, spread it onto like a piece of wood, and then put that piece of wood underwater, and it just like kept burning. It's wild. I think it's like a type of pitch, which is often used for like torches and stuff. But again, you get that stuff sprayed on you, it's going to stick to you, and it's going to burn. And it's bad. It's real nasty stuff. Anyway, here's Emperor Leo. And as you can see, not even like a cross image, just like no kind of icons. We should at least start the Carolingian line. Although even though this is like probably the main part of this chapter, I'll go ahead and start it since we do have 15 minutes left. So, going back to the Merovingians, the various Merovingian heirs were constantly fighting each other or trying not to get killed by like assassins. So none of their focus was on actually running the kingdom. So the mayors of the palace would often be the ones actually doing the job. And during this time of do-nothing kings, the mayors of the palace were the ones running the various kingdoms. So eventually we get to Pepin of Heristal. 687, he managed to defeat the other mayors of the palace and essentially took over all of Francia for himself. Again, not as a king. He was still mayor of the palace, but he was doing everything that the kings would be doing, which is something that's going to be important real soon. His son, Charles the Hammer Martel, so called due to a major battle between Tours and Poitiers, managed to push the Muslims back into Spain. So he stopped Islam from spreading into the rest of Europe. And due to his status as this like crazy war hero, he actually ruled without a Merovingian king. With Pepin, there was still a Merovingian king. He just happened to be doing all the work. With Charles Martel, there wasn't even a Merovingian king. He just ran everything. He still was technically not king, but he just was doing everything. And there wasn't even like a figurehead in place to, placate everybody, because everybody liked Charles Martel so much they weren't worried about it. Anyway, here he is at the big battle, pushing back Islamic forces. Of course, this real big dramatic cross here, just in case you weren't sure what was going on. So after Charles Martel died, his two sons, Carloman and Pepin, because, let's just name him after his grandfather, essentially ran the two halves of France, but they were not as well liked by the people because, again, they didn't single-handedly fight back encroaching Islam. So they had to find a Merovingian figurehead, which ended up being Childeric III, who was just he was related to the Merovingian kings, but I don't think he could even read. He was a nobody. But technically he had royal blood, so they were able to put him in power just to placate the people who were like, we need an actual king. By 747, Carloman retired to become a monk, which is historians speak for he was threatened by his brother and was told, hey, you can go and be a monk and give up all your claims to your portion of land, or you might find a knife in your ribs. So Carloman did the smart thing and went to become a monk, which left Pepin with the rest of Francia. So 751, he went to the church, and due to his connections, basically spoke to the Pope and had the Merovingian line overthrown. Because basically Pepin went to the Pope, who he was already friends with, and asked the Pope, hey, who should be king, the one with the title or the one who does the work of the king? And the Pope, who was already biased, this wasn't a real question, this was just making it formal, was like, the person who does the work of the king should be king. And therefore, the guy who they had brought in anyway, and probably didn't even know what was going on, was overthrown. because as it was said at this time, God, not man, made kings, and therefore the Pope, who spoke for God, essentially said, hey, Pepin, your family should be kings. It's not technically Pepin, though. And then also we had the donation of Pepin. He attacked the Lombards and gave that land to the church, which becomes the Papal States. And then there's more behind that, but we'll get to that later. Anyway, here's Pepin the Short. It's nice that he has a statue because he's nowhere near as famous as his son. So let's very quickly get into Charlemagne. So again, Pepin was not technically the king of France, or king of Francia, I should say, but he made it so that his family line would become kings. So the first king of his line was his son, Charlemagne. And that's why the line is called the Carolingian line, because it's Charlemagne's line. The Frankish kingdom expanded its lands, taken by pagan tribes, and his goal was not just to rule the land, but make the people Christian. To the point that like rivers would literally run red with blood when villages would not convert to Christianity. Like it was, we're going to tie your arms and legs, force you down on your knees, hold a sword to your throat, and ask you if you want to convert. And if you don't, we'll just cut your throat and throw you in the river. And that happened a lot. His armies were also close to what will be seen as medieval infantry and heavy cavalry. Heavy cavalry was really a new invention because of stirrups, which if you've ever ridden a horse, you know what a stirrup is. That's where you put your feet. Before this point, there were not stirrups. You just held on like with your thigh muscles, and you couldn't really use heavy weapons because if you're going by with a horse and you hit somebody with something heavy, you're falling off that horse. Before this point, most cavalry were for like command, and sometimes fighting other cavalry. But after this point, we had actual like heavy cavalry that would run in and just decimate formations. His vassals were given tracts of land, so those that fought with him were given land as recompense, or I guess like as a reward. And this will become the beginning of nobility. These families who fought, or these guys who fought for Charlemagne, their families would then become nobility because, well, they were given land and noble titles. He controlled the church within his territory, used it as a branch of the government. So he had various things he did here. Let's see, royal officials, missi dominici, or lord's agents. You had one that would administer secular justice and one that would administer ecclesiastical justice. So if you were doing church crimes, the ecclesiastical official would come and find you. If you were doing regular, like, government crimes, the secular official would come and find you. They carried capitularies, which is, chapters. The capitula are just chapters, which were basically like federal law, to use a modern term. They were royal laws that superseded regional laws. If a regional law had a different punishment for a crime, these capitularies, make sure I said that right. The capitularies would override that. If you do a federal crime, the federal government's going to get you. It doesn't matter if the state has a lesser sentence for it. And then finally, and this is a decent place to end, Charlemagne became emperor of a new Roman Empire in the year 800. In fact, I believe it was Christmas Day 800. He became emperor. He went to the Pope, and the Pope crowned him as the emperor of a new Roman Empire, which would become the Holy Roman Empire. Supposedly, Charlemagne didn't know that this was going to happen. He's like, oh, I'm just going to go and visit the Pope on Christmas Day. And the Pope just suddenly crowned me as the emperor of the new Rome. I didn't know that, which is a lie. But that's just how he did things. So this is Charlemagne's empire with these various regions that he gradually moved his way into. The Spanish March in particular was this buffer zone between France and Spain. And then the Papal States here that were given by Pepin. Yeah, that's it for now. And we'll talk about the cultures on Wednesday. So yeah, this is a Charlemagne. This is the start of what we would think of as modern Europe. I mean, obviously not until the end of the Middle Ages, but I mean, that's France. And as we're going to see, like, his sons essentially create France and Germany, and really even Italy going forward. So it's very important for, like, modern European history, or modern day Europe. Also, apparently, Charlemagne got around. There's a large percentage of people in Europe who are related to Charlemagne. Apparently, let's see, can I go back to, yeah, this one isn't as good, but some images of Charlemagne, take a step back. Oh no, I can't remember the guy's name. He was Saruman in Lord of the Rings and Count Dooku in Star Wars. I can't remember his name. Anyway, he's like a direct descendant of Charlemagne. And in some of the images, some of the like medieval paintings of Charlemagne looks just like the guy. So that's fun. Anyway, that's it. We'll talk more about the Carolingian cultures next time. But yeah, so this is the early Middle Ages, and more importantly, Charlemagne. He made the Middle Ages, or at least his descendants. So yeah.